Okay. Thanks everyone for registering and joining in on the webinar. My name's Melissa. I've been working in the R&D Tax Incentive for a few years now, both from the private sector side as well as spending a few years with the federal government. I thought it would be interesting to do a session on IT claims. IT claims are becoming more and more prevalent and across all sectors. So it's not just a matter of IT companies, software companies that are submitting these sorts of claims. As different aspects of industry become more automated, companies are trying to achieve efficiencies. We're seeing IT-based claims being made across all sectors. You know, engineering, industrial manufacturing, food and beverage. And over the last few years, I've really seen a lot of interesting compliance issues come up with the regulators in relation to IT, and just getting more of an insight into how they view IT claims, what they want to see. So I thought, let's do a session about this, but get into some of the more nitty-gritty on questions you're actually going to get from the regulators, and how that impacts on what your project descriptions look like. So we will go through just a very quick refresher on what the tax incentive is, how descriptions need to be structured, what is the current government guidance. So, you know, there will be this mix of the information that's released publicly online mixed in with the information you get from them when you are in compliance with them and you're having those one-on-one discussions with them. So then what are the practical implications of that? What does that mean for how I write my description, what's in, what's out, and then some areas perhaps to avoid at the end. So I have allowed for some Q&A time at the end of this, but if anyone, we're going through slides and a particular piece of info resonates with you and a question comes up, feel free to type it through and I'll answer as best as I can. So in terms of what is the tax incentive, we'll just go through this fairly quickly. I'm sure most of you know. The tax incentive's been around for a long time. It's had a few different forms over the years, and it's jointly delivered by AusIndustry and the ATO. So you have AusIndustry that reviews your project descriptions and looks at, is your project description, these activities you're listing, do they match, you know, what the legislation says about what is R&D? And then you've got the ATO that looks at the expenditure side of it. So in terms of timing, you've got 10 months after the end of your financial year to lodge your application with AusIndustry. At the moment, because of what's happened with all the bushfires, with COVID-19, the government has given it an extension for FY19 claims. So those lodgements have now been given an extension until 30th of September 2020, which is handy. And you can keep lodging each year that you've got eligible activities, eligible expenditure. And then the expenditure side of it goes into the company tax return and the ATO will process your benefit. So, and now activities. This I just wanted to do a quick refresh on, because later on we're going to start talking about the details of, okay, how do we structure our core and supporting activities for IT specifically. So we've got core activities that are the actual experiments you're undertaking, and the supporting activities that are all the bits and pieces you need to do to get to the point where you can conduct an experiment. So in IT projects, supporting activities might be, you know, you're setting up the test environment, actually writing the algorithms, completing the coding, collecting data. You need to do all of these things before you can get to the point of actually testing, okay, does my coding work? What errors are coming up? So, and again, this links in very closely to the structure we're going to talk about later. You know, the legislation says a core activity, an experiment, it's something where you don't know the outcome. So you have to apply this systematic progression of work, which is an experimental process, for the predominant purpose of generating new knowledge. So what does that actually mean? The important parts here that we're going to be talking about are really the hypothesis and the experiment. So being really specific in your hypothesis and the technical variables that you're testing when it comes to IT. And then, you know, you're conducting the experiment, you're looking at the results. Okay, so that was a very quick refresh on what the tax incentive is, what the structure is of your project descriptions. So what is the government saying about IT? What are they saying about software claims? Over the last few years, AusIndustry has released a few guidance documents on IT and what they want to see and what they don't want to see. IT becomes a bit more challenging because it's not this tangible thing, like if you're you know, making a widget, this physical thing that you can see and feel. It's this, you know, software is this intangible thing that you can't see, and it is harder sometimes to describe why what you're doing is actually R&D and not just standard software development. So some of the things that we've seen the regulators repeat quite a lot is that new functionality doesn't mean it's R&D. So quite often companies will think, well, look, I'm developing this piece of software that has this functionality that no one else on the market has. And that's fine, but then you need to take the next step in actually explaining, okay, why is achieving this new functionality challenging from an IT point of view? There's been a lot of back and forth also around this notion of, well, we've gone through the software development cycle, you know, we're using agile development methodologies, therefore we're doing tests, therefore it's R&D. And part of the regulator's struggle here is that the process of testing when it comes to day-to-day software development versus testing when it is actual R&D, that process for software, it looks the same. So just because you've undertaken this testing regime or you're using Agile doesn't automatically mean it's R&D. Again, you need to take that next step of, okay, this is the testing structure that we employed, but here's an explanation of why what we were doing was actually challenging. There are existing ways, but we're trying to find the most efficient way. So this can still be R&D, and sometimes it comes down to just choosing the better way to describe it, certain words that you're better off using. So yeah, just something to be mindful of. And commercial innovation, mistaking commercial innovation for technical innovation, that is, you know, the same sort of thing where we're talking about new functionality versus actual technical innovation. Don't hang your whole claim on the fact that it's new functionality. Go down and explain why that new functionality involved technical innovation. Claiming whole of project instead of specific activities. This is quite a common issue. It can be very tempting to have, you know, a broad project, and this is quite common in certain industries, certain companies, you know, you'll have as part of your strategic planning going forward, you know, we want to achieve all these IT-based efficiencies, software-based efficiencies. So therefore, it can be tempting to use broad wording, try and get most of this work into the claim. So, you know, you need to look at that broader project and break it down into, okay, this is the broad project we're doing. Here are the pockets of R&D that we need to pull out. Customized solutions or implementations of existing software packages. So look, if you're taking off-the-shelf software and sort of using it as it's intended to be used, then that's not going to be enough. But where it could be enough is if you're taking that off-the-shelf software and you are using it for something outside of its intended use. So maybe it will work, maybe it doesn't. That's where we can start talking about R&D. So yeah, those are the recurring themes that I've seen consistently over the past, you know, 4 or so years in direct conversations with the regulator, but then also being released in the guidance that they're putting out on their website. There was also a lot of discussion around what can be an experiment versus what might just be a supporting activity. So when IT claims started to first become more prevalent, there was a lot of core activities based around bug testing, beta testing, user acceptance testing. You know, just because you're doing these things doesn't mean that they meet the threshold for what is a core activity. You need to be able to link it back to your hypothesis. So for example, you know, you might be making routine updates to certain systems, and you've got to do some bug testing just to make sure, you know, everything works, nothing's horribly wrong. That in itself isn't going to be enough to be a core activity, but actually does that bug testing relate back to some key technical issues that we're experiencing? This isn't routine software development. That's where you need to be careful. Excuse me. So what are the practical implications of this? You know, we talk about this is what the government wants to see. These are the things you need to be focusing on. But I mean, at the end of the day, you've still got to go away and actually write a project description that makes sense, that meets these requirements. How do you do that? So I think the easiest thing to do is start with the technical objectives. The technical objectives almost create this domino effect that the regulator will look at. So each core activity has to have its own set of technical objectives. And as I was saying before, it can't just describe functionality, but why is that functionality hard to achieve in scientific terms, and make it as specific as possible. So it will be tempting to say, well, you know, I'm developing you know, a new data analysis algorithm. I'm developing a new algorithm, and that's hard. But you need to take the next step on why is that hard, and then that starts to build your tech objective. You know, it's hard because it's got to access heaps of different data sets, internal and external to the organisation. It's got to have a low error rate. It's got to process in real time. I'm using a different type of software architecture that hasn't been used for this purpose before. Am I repurposing algorithms? Those are the things that you need to start to break down when it comes to the tech objectives. And when I said it can be a bit of a domino effect, if Oz industry doesn't see tech objectives that make sense, then because everything is closely linked, they might come back and say, I don't understand any of this, you need to explain all of this to me again, because I'm saying here on this slide, everything's really closely linked. So the same language that you're using in the technical objectives translates to the language that you use around the new knowledge you're developing. Those technical variables that you're talking about in your tech objectives reflect those in the hypothesis, reflect those in the experimental steps and the outcomes, because that then starts to link it all together, and it makes it easier for the person at the other end to make sense of what you're writing about. And the key thing to remember is, you know, that if your application gets picked up for review, all that person at the other end is getting is this application that you submit. They probably don't know anything about your company or you. They're not IT experts, so you need to help them along the way, explain it. It can be a fine balance between explaining it in layman's terms, but not losing the technical language that really adequately describes those challenges. That's quite important. We've touched on this a little bit, but you know, what's the difference between software development and R&D? So again, this is something that is almost always comes up when there's discussion with the regulator around this just looks like regular software development that anyone does. So, you know, part of being able to answer this question is being able to say, you know, on the basis of publicly available knowledge, I couldn't address my technical objectives. I couldn't just go hire someone that would come to me and say, yep, you know, go and hire an expert that would know I can do this. I know how to address your technical issues. You know, you've got to provide a fair bit of detail and talk about, you know, when it comes to outcome unknown, talk about, you know, I went out and I spoke to these companies. I did desktop research. I did some travel to some different conferences and shows, whatever it might be, and I just can't find anything that's going to help me. And from that, you start explaining, you know, there aren't available platforms, algorithms that I can take off the shelf. Software integration has become a really common thing that we see in core activities. It's driven by a few different things. So you might find sometimes an entity has really, they're relying on a heavily customized software platform that was really expensive and it's really old. Because it was really expensive and there's a lot of customization in it, no one's going to spend the, you know, $5 million it might cost to upgrade that. So when you want to get that platform to talk to other new platforms, that might take you a fair bit of R&D to achieve that. So that's where the integration, it's not trivial, right? It's quite difficult and it's unique because you're dealing with this heavily customized, expensive system. That's just one example. Algorithm development is not automatically R&D. There's had a lot of conversations with the regulators around this. I think because it is genuinely hard to describe technical objectives as they relate to IT projects, people just say, I'm developing a new algorithm. It's new. It's R&D. The regulator in that instance will always come back, if they pick up your application, they'll always come back and ask why. Just because you're doing some new coding doesn't mean it's R&D. Why is this hard? Again, the functionality issue. Again, having this IT project that supports a larger part of the strategic piece for the business going forward. It's fine. And at the upfront pieces of the application, it can be good to provide some of that background to give the guys some broader context and then dive into, okay, this is the actual R&D component of it. This is my experiment. Documentation also can be really important here. I mean, you always need to keep contemporaneous documentation to back up whatever you're saying in your application. You know, you're saying, I did this experiment, I collected this data, etc., etc. What documents do you have to back that up? And because software projects move fast, it's, you know, your documentation might be handwritten diagrams and notes, different systems where you're keeping a log. Developers can go in and keep a log of what they're doing, of what's going on. They don't want to see the coding itself because it makes no sense to them. They want to see, you know, if there's reporting on what the outcome of the experiment was, even if there's email correspondence where you've run the code and you know, the developer's coming back to you and saying, ran the test, these 5 errors popped up, we need to work on this. Things like that are important in terms of documentation. So there is an internal administration exclusion in the legislation. So you've got the words in the legislation, and then you've got AusIndustry who've come out with some words around that. So basically, if you're a company and you are doing R&D on internal systems that are really just about your internally, you know, different functions that are just specific to you internally as a company, you're developing a new payroll system, financial reporting system that could end up being caught under this internal administration exclusion. But let's say you're developing a new payroll system that meets the, you know, requirements of a core activity, and you're selling it externally, well, then it's not for your internal purposes. That's when you can start talking about, okay, get around the internal admin exclusion. This isn't just about how we internally run our company. This is about how we help our customers. So just be aware of that. Are there particular areas we should avoid? So again, this one can become a bit challenging because it's not always as obvious where you draw the line on the R&D being completed when it comes to software. But if you're getting to the point of you're writing user documentation, you're rolling it out. This isn't just, you know, selective rollout. This is the full rollout. Are you just doing maintenance on existing systems? I would avoid including those. You know, when the software actually goes live, don't include that. But, you know, the software might go live and you think everything's fine, and then there's this horrible issue or something goes catastrophically wrong. And then you might have to go back to the drawing board, and then there's another R&D project that could come out of that because you didn't realize, oh, this completely random issue's come up. We've got to now go back and do some more R&D to try and fix it. Some of these things we've already touched on, you know, if you're tweaking, if you are there's been a lot of discussion actually around user interfaces and development of user interfaces. Traditionally, again, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there were a fair few core activities based around developing the user interface, and the regulator released guidance, and, you know, I had some conversations with them around, you know, at what point is that actually R&D? If you are just trying to make the user interface look nicer so that it is more appealing to your customer, then that's not enough. But it could still be a supporting activity, because at the end of the day, you need a user interface so that, you know, you can give it to someone that they can use the system, they can test it and see what happens. So more likely to be a supporting activity. There could be instances where you're doing something really tricky with data analysis that then has an impact on that user interface. It's just something to be careful of. Again, debugging, unless you can link it back to your technical objectives. Other target areas that we've seen quite a lot of, I'll start with Australian versus overseas activities. So when it comes to software developers, it's quite common for a lot of Australian-based companies to seek assistance from overseas-based software developers because in a lot of instances they're cheaper. So when it comes to your regular annual R&D claims, you cannot include significant overseas activities. We need to look at where is the developer physically based. If the developer is physically based overseas and they're doing a chunk of R&D work for you, but they're not physically in Australia, you can't include that in your regular annual claim. There is a separate process for getting approval for overseas activities and the associated expenditure, but you need, when it comes to software, you'd need to be able to say that expertise doesn't exist in Australia, hence I've had to go overseas. You can't just make the argument of it was cheaper overseas, so I did it over there. You know, even if it's massively cheaper, you need to be able to link it back to the expertise of that individual. Insufficient documentation, that's an issue across all projects, all industries, but it is always harder for IT because it moves very fast and it's not like, you know, a heavily regulated industry, say like medical or defense, where the level of regulation automatically forces a detailed level of documents to be kept. So, you know, that's where it's important to maybe just remember, take notes or emails that are relevant, chuck them in a folder. You know, if you're writing a software brief to give to the developers, that's handy. You know, any contracts that you sign with the developers, those things are important. Using known techniques and having, you know, is the knowledge gap sufficient? Is it just trial and error? So the regulator makes a distinction between, is this trial and error or is this true R&D? They would view trial and error as just tweaking here and there. You know, I try it, I test something, does it work, yes or no, tweak it a little bit. As opposed to there's this, you know, I can't get it to process in real time, I can't meet my error rates, there's a big problem here. So that's where it becomes really important to go back and remember how everything links together, how your tech objective language then needs to feed into the discussion on what have you done to determine that the current knowledge base isn't sufficient for you to fill that knowledge gap. What is the knowledge gap? And remember that it doesn't matter if you are, your R&D project that you're working on, you know that your competitors are working on something similar. That doesn't mean what you're doing is not R&D, because that's confidential information for your competitor. They're not going to tell you how to achieve your technical issues, what they did to complete their R&D. You need to establish this outcome uncertain, establish this knowledge gap on the basis of publicly available information. So I think we're pretty well on time here. That was all the details that I wanted to go through. And now if there's any questions people want to throw out, feel free to type a question into the chat box and I can have a look at that. But otherwise, Otherwise, I would just encourage people to remember that domino effect. Remember, start with your tech objectives, go through the detail, really explain what you did to establish the current knowledge base. You can attach things to your submission if you think it will help, but you know, if it doesn't add value, don't attach it. Sometimes diagrams can be quite helpful because software is harder to visualize sometimes. So sometimes a diagram, you know, speaks 1,000 words. That can be the sort of thing that's useful to attach. So it doesn't look like there's any questions coming up. But look, if anyone wants to get in touch, have any questions, any issues, feel free to get in contact. Now that some of the restrictions are being lifted, happy to meet face to face, meet at a cafe, meet at your office, whatever it might be, or you know, also happy to have a phone call to talk through any questions you might have. Otherwise, I might leave it there. Thanks everyone for logging in, having a listen, and I look forward to hearing from you.